I will log into MonetDB as administrator. My password is MonetDB, and I will set default schema to be VOC. So I will say set schema VOC, and now I will create one sample table, and the name of this table is parent table. That is for permanent table. After that, I will insert some data into this table, and then we can read from this table with select statement. Now, this is a normal database table, but today we will talk about temporary tables. When we execute a query in MonetDB, the result of that query will be saved to a table, or it will be sent to a client application. If we do not do that, then the result of a query will be discarded. On the other side, when we save data into a normal table, that data will be saved permanently. But beside queries and tables, there is also one other structure that is called temporary tables. Temporary tables will keep our data, but only for short and limited period of time. I will now clean my screen. I will now create one local temporary table. Local temporary table means that this table will last only for duration of one session. And also default behavior of temporary tables is that they will lose their data after each transaction. But I want to avoid that. I want to observe behavior of my table. So I will use this subclause on commit preserve rows. So my temporary table will keep its data even after the end of transaction. So I will run this. Then I will insert some data in my temporary table. My temporary table will save this data because of this subclause. So I can read my data by using select statement. Now, temporary tables are created in temporary schema, but when we want to read from them, we don't have to provide that prefix for the schema. But we can do that if we want to. For example, if I want to provide that prefix, I can, and I will get the same result. Now, if we want to create temporary table in some other schema, I will now try to create temporary table inside of VOC schema. I will fail because this is not allowed. Temporary tables can only be created in temporary schema. Now, because temporary tables are created in temporary schemas, that means that I can create a temporary table with the same name as my sample table. The name of my sample table was parent table, but that permanent table was inside of the VOC schema. And this temporary table will be created in temporary schemas, that is in another schema, so I can have two tables with the same name. But this is one thing that is interesting. If we now try to read from parent table, we will actually get temporary table. So I have just created temporary table. It is empty. So this is my temporary table. And now if we want to read from that real permanent table, then we have to provide prefix. Now currently we are inside of VOC schema. That is our default schema. But when we use just the name of a table, temporary table will have priority. For permanent tables, now we have to provide prefix, and this is the way how we can read from permanent table in this case. I also want to tell you that it is not possible to create permanent objects in temporary schema. If I, for example, jump here to temporary schema, and if I try to create normal table inside of temporary schema, I will fail because we cannot create persistent objects in temporary schema. I will now clean my screen. I will again change my schema back to VOC. And now we will see some characteristics of temporary tables. I will first show you that we can combine permanent tables and temporary tables inside of one query. So if I run this, this will succeed. Next, I will try to insert number 3 in my temporary table, but this will fail. This will fail because when I have created this temporary table, I place primary key constraint on number column. So we cannot have two values 3 instead of number column because of this primary key constraint. Next, we will see that we can export data from temporary tables into CSV file. So I will use copy into statement. Then I will go here to desktop, and this is my file. I will open it in Notepad, and this is our data from our table. I will delete numbers 3 and 4, and here I will type number 5. I will save this, and I will close this CSV file. I will go back to terminal, and now I will read from that CSV file. I will read that number 5, and I will add it to my temporary table. I will then read from temporary table, and here we will see that we have one more row. So now we have number 5. We can use update and delete statements. For example, we can update this number 5 to be number 6. If we now read from our table, we will see that now we have 6 in this third row. We can delete that third row by using delete statement. So I will use delete statement, and then I will again read from my table, and we will see that now we again have only 2 rows. What is important is that we cannot alter our temporary table. For example, if I run this statement that will add new column, this will fail because we cannot alter temporary table. If we try to remove primary key constraint from my temporary table, this will also fail. So we cannot alter temporary tables. What is possible is to create a new view on our table. So I will create view inside of VOC schema that is based on our temporary table. So I will run this, and then we can try to use our view, and we will see that everything is working. And I will do one more thing. I will try to create foreign key constraint, and I will create that constraint on our permanent table, and this permanent table will reference our temporary table, and this is also not allowed. This will also not work because we cannot create foreign key between temporary and non-temporary tables. I will now clean my screen. Although our temporary table is temporary, we will still have some records about it in system tables. For example, if we read from systables table, and if we search for our temporary table, we will find the record about it inside of this system table. But if we try to get some statistics about our temporary table, we will fail because we cannot get statistics about temporary tables. I will clean my screen. I will now try to read from my temporary table, but not from this session, but I will go to this second tab, and here I will log in as VOC user. I will use password VOC, and if I now try to use this statement that will read from temp table, this will fail because in one session we cannot see tables, temporary tables that are created in other sessions. That also means that we can freely create temporary table inside of this session that has the name temp table. Although such temporary table do exist in this other session, this will not make a difference inside of this session because this session is totally isolated, so we can freely create another temporary table with the same name. I will now go back to this first session, and I will show you that the scope of our temporary table is limited to one session. I will quit this session, and then I will again log in as administrator. Password is MonetDB, and now I will try to read from my temporary table, and I will fail. So after the end of session, our temporary tables, local temporary tables, will be fully deleted. Now, before the end of session, it is also possible to explicitly delete our temporary table by using a drop table statement. I will now clean my screen. We will now see the default behavior of local temporary tables is to lose its data after the end of transaction. So I will create another local temporary table, But this time, instead of onCommit preserve rows, I will use default onCommit delete rows. So I will run this. Then I will insert some data inside of this temporary table. And we know that we are currently using auto transactions. So after each statement, transaction will commit. So that is default behavior in Monet. So just like I said, after transaction, data will be deleted. So if we now try to read from our table, we will see nothing. So the only way now to make our temporary table useful is to explicitly start a transaction. So I will start a transaction. Then I will enter some data into my table. And because I'm currently still inside of this transaction, I can see my data. So if I use select star from temporary table, I will be able to see my data. And at the end, if I apply commit, my data will again disappear. So if we now again read from my table will again be empty. I will now clean my screen. It is possible to create temporary table based on some other table. So I will run this statement here, and I will create another temporary table that is based on the already existing temporary table. This will be successful. We can also create temporary table that is based on permanent table. So I'm using this VOC perm table. I will run this, and this is also successful. And by default, we are using with data. That means that we are inherit not just the structure of a table, but also the data. If I now read from this temp table tree, I will see both the table and the data. But it is also possible to inherit only the structure of a table. So I will create another temporary table, but this time I will use this subclause with no data. So with data is default, but now I will use with no data. I will run it. And then if I read from this temp table 4, I will get only the structure of a table without data. I will now clean my screen. Beside the local temporary tables, we can also have global temporary tables. Global temporary tables are permanent in one way because their definition, their name, column names, and data types are permanent. But on the other side, data is not permanent. Data is temporary, and data will be deleted at the end of transaction or at the end of a session. What is special about global temporary tables is that only users that have authorization over temporary schema can create global temporary tables. In our example, administrator can create global temporary tables, but VOC user cannot. And because definition of global temporary tables is shared between users, the name of global temporary table should be unique. Now, while users are sharing definition of global temporary table, they are not sharing data. So if one user insert some data into global temporary table, the other user will not be able to see that data. But the other user will be able to use that table with his own data. So everyone has his own data, and they can play with that data inside of the global temporary table that has the same structure for all of the users. Characteristics of global temporary tables are similar to characteristics of local temporary tables. So again, we can use select, delete, update. We can import, export CSV files. We cannot alter global temporary tables. We can create views on them, so they are quite similar in that regard to local temporary tables. I will now try to create global temporary table, but I will try that as a VOC user. So I will go to this other tab. I will paste here my statement. I'm trying to create global temporary table. I will run this, and I won't be able because I have insufficient privileges. So I have to go to this first tab, and here I'm administrator. Again, I will paste my statement. I will run it, and now operation is successful, and it will only be successful if this is a unique name for a table in temporary schema. It is also interesting about global temporary tables that we can get some statistics about them. So I can run this statement here and I will get data about my global temporary table. I will now clear my screen. Now that we have global temporary table, we can insert some data into it. So I will insert values 5 and 6, and then we can read from our global temporary table. But we can read our data only inside of this session. If we jump to this other session, here we are VOC user, and if we now try to read from our global temporary table, we will see an empty table. And this is because this definition of a table is shared, but data is not shared. So data is unique for each user. And we saw previously that this VOC user cannot create global temporary table, but he can use the existing ones. For example, he can insert his own data inside of this global temporary table. And now we have the same table, but that table has one set of data for VOC user, and for administrator, it has a different set of data. At the end, I want to talk about when to use temporary tables. If we have one big flow table, we can take an excerpt from that table because we don't need all of its data. We just need some part of it, and then we will get a really small table so we can run our queries on that small table. The other thing is that temporary tables are transient. So they will disappear after some time, and data in them is isolated from one user to another user. So they are great for experiments and tests. We can use temporary tables as intermediate steps in our queries, but we shouldn't do that. If we have a need to create intermediate steps that are tables, then we should use common table expressions. In that way, our queries will be much more performant.